The Dark Scrolls. They said the palace gleamed with divine authority, marble floors polished to mirror the heavens, curtains of crimson velvet brushing the ankles of queens, and golden thrones so heavy with jewels they seemed forged by God himself. But no scripture had ever described what the sheets smelled like in the queen's bedchamber after a night of state-sanctioned duty. No monk dared record the hush that fell over a royal concubine's cell when her bleeding didn't come, and no portrait, no matter how masterfully painted, ever captured the hollow-eyed silence of a woman who had failed to provide a son. In palaces across centuries and empires, what was done behind closed doors was not always for pleasure. It was for power, legacy, control, and often survival. Take, for instance, the court of Tudor England. Elizabeth of York had once lain in a grand bed draped in red damask, her face composed as her husband, Henry VII, performed the knightly obligation of a king to produce an heir. Behind the chamber doors, noblemen and bishops whispered prayers for fertility, as if her womb were a battlefield upon which England's future depended. When the deed was done, maids would clean the linens, careful not to flinch at stains too dark or too pale. If conception failed, she bore the blame, regardless of whether her husband's health had withered from disease or exhaustion. Royal intimacy, even in its most private form, was never truly private. When Catherine of Aragon came to Henry VIII as a widow and a Spanish princess, her body was more political territory than womanly form. The question of her virginity, whether her first husband, Arthur Tudor, had consummated their brief marriage, haunted her like a shadow. That single detail decided her right to become Queen of England. Years later, when she could no longer produce children, her failure became national crisis. Even in sacred spaces like the chapel, whispered doubts echoed louder than the choir. Was the queen still capable of her duty? Behind the embroidery and brocade, wives were vessels. Not mistresses, not lovers. Vessels. They were meant to receive, conceive, deliver, and repeat until a living, legitimate boy crowned their suffering. But England was hardly alone in this brutal intimacy. Far across the Channel, Versailles glittered in gold, but underneath its chandeliers festered a decadence so calculated it became political performance. Louis XIV, the Sun King, kept his court close, packed within the palace like bees in a jeweled hive. He dined, dressed, and defecated under the eyes of dozens, and his mistresses were selected not merely for beauty, but for usefulness. Madame de Montespan was not simply a lover, she was an institution. Her apartments within Versailles were more lavish than those of the queen. When the king came to her chambers, the walls echoed with music and laughter, but also the rustle of notes passed under doors, the calculated flutters of lashes from courtiers hoping to ride her coattails to power. And when she began to age, when new girls with younger skin smiled too brightly in the hall of mirrors, Montespan grew desperate. Rumors whispered that she turned to dark rituals, love spells, even human offerings, just to keep the king's eye from wandering. Whether true or not, it didn't matter. She was soon replaced. What appeared as seduction was often survival. The Queen, Marie-Thérèse of Spain, stood by dutifully. The king was hers in title only. While Versailles spun in a spiral of sensuality, the Queen's world shrank into piety and solitude. Her role was clear: produce heirs and pretend not to feel. And yet, even in the East, where eunuchs stood at every entrance and silks muffled every whisper, the rules of palace desire were no less cruel. Within the imperial harem of Topkapi Palace, the women were not wives, they were captives. Chosen for beauty, trained for obedience, locked away from the world. They were not allowed to look out of windows. Their names were often replaced with new ones, more exotic, more pleasing, more forgettable. And when the Sultan came, they were expected to smile, to entertain, to become the mirror of his power. But if they bore a son, the game changed. The stakes multiplied. Because in the Ottoman world, sons meant succession, and succession meant danger. Sultans had long feared the fratricidal wars that tore apart earlier generations. So, new laws permitted the reigning sultan to execute his brothers, sometimes as infants, to ensure peace, which meant that a concubine who gave birth not only gained prestige, but made her child a potential target. One harem woman, Kosem Sultan, rose above them all. She was cunning, shrewd, and patient. First a concubine, then a mother, she pulled strings from behind the lattice walls of the harem until she ruled as regent over her sons and grandsons. But her path was carved in blood and betrayal. She lived long enough to see one of her own children strangle another. She died at the hands of palace rivals who feared her shadow more than her sword. Royal intimacy, it seemed, was less about closeness and more about consequence. In every palace, every empire, behind every silk curtain and lacquered screen, the same quiet pattern emerged: women with bruised hearts and guarded smiles, men whose desires were dictated by dynastic desperation, and walls that knew far more than they would ever tell. And in the palaces of the Qing dynasty, the silence was even heavier. Imperial concubines lived not only within strict hierarchy, but beneath a code of invisibility. The emperor could summon any of them with a nod, but if he did not summon them, they remained ghosts, forbidden to leave their quarters, forbidden to speak without being asked, forbidden to age. When the emperor selected a concubine for the night, a ritual began. A eunuch would deliver a warm cloth for her to wash herself. Another would carry her, wrapped in cloth, to the emperor's quarters. Her name would be recorded, her presence documented. And if conception occurred, she might rise. If not, she might never be called again. To love a king was to be forgotten by morning. And still there were moments of tenderness, fleeting and rare. A secret glance, a half-whispered joke, a child born of true affection rather than duty. But such things were accidents, not design. The palace, no matter where or when, was a stage, and behind its velvet curtains, the performances that mattered most weren't scripted for romance, but for lineage. Because to be born royal was to be watched from the moment you drew breath. But to lie with royalty, that was to be used, weighed, and often discarded. The chambers were gilded, but the air within was heavy, with duty, with fear, and with secrets that would never see daylight. The walls of royal palaces were not made of stone alone. They were layered with whispers, fear, and the echoes of footsteps padded in silk. They breathed with the rhythm of expectation, of sons yet unborn, of alliances waiting to be sealed in the shape of an infant's face, and beneath those gilded ceilings a woman's womb was no longer hers. It belonged to the crown, to legacy, to fate. After the king's desire was spent, the true burden began. A mistress might be cast aside, a concubine might be forgotten, but a wife, a queen, was chained to an unyielding clock. She was to carry the bloodline like a sacred flame, but with no power over the winds that might extinguish it. In Tudor England, Queen Jane Seymour, third wife to Henry VIII, achieved what her predecessors could not. She bore a male heir. The child, Edward VI, was frail from the first breath, but his birth was celebrated with grotesque grandeur. Bells tolled, wine flowed, nobles danced in candle-lit halls. But Jane bled. The midwives knew the signs. Her lips turned pale, her eyes hollowed. They pressed herbs against her belly, whispered charms, and wept as she faded slowly, dying not of violence but of the sacrifice the crown demanded. 11 days later, she was dead. It was a triumph wrapped in tragedy, a common pattern in palaces that treated childbirth not as a miracle, but as a transaction. Queen Anne of Denmark, wife to James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, bore many children. Few survived. The court recorded their deaths with formal detachment, lost at birth, stillborn, dead in the cradle, as if noting the spoiling of fruit in a royal orchard. But behind each entry was a night of labor, a body torn, and a soul left hollow. Yet she smiled in portraits, her belly hidden beneath brocade, her grief tucked behind painted eyes. In France, the production of heirs was a public affair, quite literally. The birth of a royal child in Versailles was not a private moment. It was a performance. When Queen Marie Antoinette gave birth, noblemen and women crowded into her chamber. Some stood atop chairs, others leaned over her as she cried in pain. The windows were flung open to prove she was not being replaced by a look-alike. The queen screamed as the room boiled in perfume and heat. It was not enough to bear a child, one had to do so publicly, obediently, and with grace. Behind every birth lay the dread of failure. What if it was a girl? What if it was sickly? What if it died? A woman's worth, no matter her crown, lived and died with that infant cry. Yet not all women in palaces were queens. Many were never meant to be seen at all. The mistresses, the concubines, the women behind the curtain, they bore children too. And their children could rise. In Versailles, Louis XIV's official mistresses bore him numerous children. Some were legitimized, others vanished into obscurity. The queen was forced to raise her husband's bastards, dressing them, educating them, blessing them, all while her own children died young. It was the quietest cruelty, to cradle another woman's child while your own grave grew cold. For Madame de Montespan, the king's favored mistress for over a decade, bearing his children was both power and poison. She wielded her position like a sword, whispering into the king's ear, orchestrating favors, building alliances. But each child born to her was a step deeper into a trap she could not escape, because the favor of a king is not eternal. Eventually her charm faded. Her name grew entangled in scandal, tales of dark masses and potion sellers, whispers of sacrificing infants to prolong her allure. Whether true or not, the stain remained. She was exiled from court, left to wander in exile while her children stayed behind, reshaped by royal handlers. She had borne the blood of a king, and yet her own name could not protect her. In the Ottoman harem, the stakes were even bloodier. There, each concubine who bore a son might one day become Valide Sultan, the queen mother, the most powerful woman in the empire. But only one could rise, and so, when a prince was born, so too was a game of shadows. Other women smiled but watched. They offered gifts but whispered curses. A newborn prince might live, or he might be strangled with a silken cord by the sultan's guards, executed in the name of order. And still the mothers tried. They wrapped their infants in charms, slipped honey on their tongues, paid servants to sleep outside their doors. But no prayer could guarantee survival. Qasem Sultan, once a mere concubine, lived long enough to become Valide Sultan twice over. She ruled through her sons, whispered commands from behind the veil, played the empire like a harp. But power has a scent, and others grew hungry for it. One night she was dragged from her chamber, strangled by the orders of her own grandson's mother. Her body was hidden for days, her mouth filled with stones, so her ghost could not scream. No son, no matter how noble, could promise safety. In the palaces of the Qing dynasty, the pain wore different robes. Imperial women lived in ranks, empress, noble consort, pure consort, down to mere attendants. They dressed in brocade, wore elaborate headpieces, and learned to smile without joy. The emperor could summon any of them. But to be summoned once meant little. To be summoned often meant war. Each pregnancy brought with it a battle of jealousy. Some women tried to fake illness to avoid suspicion. Others turned to poisons, not to kill, but to miscarry a rival's child. Still others accepted their fates and simply wept in silence, their hands pressed to swollen bellies, while eunuchs whispered which consort had gained the emperor's eye that week. One empress, Lady Nara, famously cut her own hair, a grave insult in Manchu culture after her husband neglected her. She was cast out, her name stripped from court records. No public scandal, no trial, just quiet erasure. In such palaces, desire had no place, nor did love. The act of creation, what poets called sacred, was reduced to timing, politics, and ritual. Some kings consulted astrologers before visiting their wives. Some performed ablutions. Some only approached during auspicious hours. The royal body was not guided by lust, but by strategy. And when all else failed, when no legitimate heir could be produced, the court turned to darker solutions: substitution, adoption, deception. In some Chinese dynasties, it is rumored that stillbirths were hidden. Another infant, healthy, unrelated, might be slipped into the cradle. Only the wet nurse would know, and she would not speak. In Versailles, there were stories of noblemen who fathered children with queens behind closed doors, with the king's blessing, or at least his indifference, if it meant securing the succession. Nothing, after all, could be allowed to break the illusion of divine continuity. But sometimes truth surfaced. One girl, born to a queen, bore the features of a dark-skinned servant. The king, furious, had the infant removed and the servant whipped. The queen wept, but was forbidden to speak of it again. The child's name was lost to history. Every palace had its shadows. Some fell softly like veils, others clung like curses. Yet the most tragic truth was this: even when the child survived, even when the heir was born, even when the lineage was secured, the mother often disappeared. Her purpose fulfilled, she became ceremonial, a ghost with a crown. And her pain, her torn body, her sleepless nights, they became invisible. Because in the history books, sons matter more than the women who bled to bring them forth. The cradle, once filled, did not end a woman's trial. For queens and concubines alike, the battle simply changed its form. What had once been pain of the body became warfare of reputation. A royal woman might succeed in birth and still perish in name, for in palaces of gold it was not enough to be fertile. One had to be pure, and so the illusion of purity was weaponized. From the western courts of Europe to the hallowed halls of Eastern dynasties, virginity, whether real or fabricated, held more power than a sword. It decided alliances, dictated dowries, and crowned queens. And when the world demanded proof, the body was made to give it, willing or not. In medieval Europe, queens were expected to arrive at the altar not just adorned in white, but unsullied in every way. Some were inspected by court matrons, their modesty traded for state validation. Others were tested through their sheets. After the wedding night, linens were displayed to nobles, stained with blood as evidence of virtue, a grotesque rite of passage turned theater. But what if there was no blood? No pain? What if she had known passion before the crown found her? Then the panic began. The advisors gathered. The bride's family begged for silence. In some cases, servants were bribed to smear chicken blood on the linen. The illusion had to be preserved. A queen's womb was a sacred vessel, but only if it had never been touched. Queen Isabella of France, married to the weak and infamous Edward II of England, found herself trapped in this nightmare. Rumors swirled that her husband preferred the company of his male favorites. Her role was to produce heirs, but her body was unwanted, unused, and slowly becoming irrelevant. She endured public humiliation, watched her influence fade, and finally, she rebelled. She took a lover, She raised an army, and she overthrew her husband. The world labeled her a she-wolf, but in truth, she had been a woman devoured and finally learned to bite back. Still, few dared such open revolt. Most were crushed beneath expectation. The chastity belt, long believed to be a device of the medieval mind, was more myth than widespread practice, but the symbol remained potent, not as a literal lock, but as a metaphor for the royal woman's fate. Her body was owned, guarded, and judged, her desires erased. At Versailles, Queen Marie Antoinette bore this burden more than most. Painted as a frivolous nymph, mocked in libels as a lustful foreigner, her every move was tracked and twisted. Her most private relationships, such as her deep friendship with the Princesse de Lamballe, were sexualized, scandalized, and weaponized. Her enemies drew her in lurid cartoons, bearing her flesh to the mobs before a single guard ever touched her. Her real crime was not desire, it was presence. A woman who laughed too freely, dressed too grandly, and dared to enjoy herself in a world that demanded silent dignity. When the revolution came, they paraded her image naked through the streets, long before they paraded her body to the guillotine. But Marie Antoinette was not the first queen destroyed by public imagination, nor the last. In Russia, Empress Catherine the Great, though not born royal, redefined the power of sexuality in the imperial court. Married off young to a cold, unstable Peter III, Catherine quickly realized her survival would not come through obedience. She cultivated alliances through charm, wit, and carefully chosen lovers, men of influence who helped her stage a coup and ascend the throne. Once empress, she maintained her control, not despite her sexuality, but through it. She was adored and feared. But history, unable to stomach the idea of a woman wielding passion and power, distorted her legacy with vulgar myths, the most infamous being that of the horse, a slanderous fabrication meant to humiliate. Even in death they tried to unmake her. Yet what Catherine embodied was not scandal, it was agency. In the Ottoman Empire, agency came with stealth. The harem was not only a place of confinement, but a court of influence veiled behind walls. Women who had once been enslaved or gifted from distant lands became players in the empire's greatest decisions. Hürrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana, was one such force. Brought as a concubine to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, she did the unthinkable. She rose from the harem to become his legal wife. The Sultan abolished the practice of taking multiple consorts for her. He wrote her letters filled with poetry and longing, even on the battlefield. But this love was not soft, it was sharp. She maneuvered her sons into positions of power, eliminated rivals with cold precision, and crafted a dynasty that reshaped the empire. To love the Sultan was to court death, but to be loved by him, that was power. Still, the harem's glamour hid its price. Thousands of women were brought from across the world, often captured or sold, trained in music, language, and charm, then discarded if they failed to rise. They were renamed, redressed, rewritten, their pasts erased, their futures, if barren, forgotten. Some poisoned themselves, others clawed for favor. Their faces do not appear in portraits, but their tears stained the same marble floors where emperors walked. In China, similar shadows gathered behind the Forbidden City's red walls. The empresses were expected to be paragons of virtue, silent, poised, endlessly obedient. Their lives were consumed by etiquette, their nights by anxiety. A whisper of jealousy could end in disgrace. A single misstep could mean confinement in the cold palace, a structure as real as it was symbolic. The cold palace was where consorts went to disappear. It was a place without servants, mirrors, or visitors. Some women died there without a soul remembering their names. Purity was not a virtue. It was a cage. And yet, Not all royal women accepted silence. In England, Anne Boleyn danced with fire. She refused to be Henry VIII's mistress. She demanded to be his wife. She was clever, calculating, and dangerously charismatic. For 6 years she resisted his advances, drawing him deeper into obsession. He tore his kingdom from the Pope to claim her. But Anne could not give him a son, only a daughter, Elizabeth. Soon courtiers whispered treason, adultery, incest. None of it proven, all of it fatal. She was executed at the Tower of London. Her final words were composed, almost serene. She died because she dared to withhold herself, and then dared to give herself too freely. Royal women walked a razor's edge, too cold, and they were unlovable, too warm, and they were harlots. The only acceptable position was stillness. The only safe desire was none. And when they failed this impossible balance, history wrote them as cautionary tales. But within those failures, something stirred. Rebellion. Some queens began to turn chastity into a weapon of their own. If they could not be saints, they would become symbols. Queen Elizabeth I of England never married. She named herself the Virgin Queen, not for lack of admirers, but as a political fortress. Her body became the realm. Her lack of heirs became a statement. No man could claim her, no child could replace her. She wielded her supposed purity like a sword, deflecting suitors, commanding armies, and building an empire. But behind the image, she was human, alone, afraid, surrounded by spies and men who questioned her every decision. She loved once Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, but he was married. When his wife died under mysterious circumstances, scandal nearly consumed them both. Elizabeth never married again. She chose the crown over companionship, and the world remembers her as eternal. In the end, chastity was not about morality, it was about control. The same body that was guarded, stripped, exalted, or discarded was never truly owned by the woman who lived in it. It was passed from father to husband, to court to history. But sometimes, within the cage, something glimmered. A moment of defiance, a whispered prayer, a refusal to be erased, because even if the world forgot their names, the walls remembered. And the curtains, those soft velvet veils that once framed beds of power and peril, they still hung heavy with secrets. Power did not always announce itself with armies or decrees. Sometimes it slipped between silks at midnight. It whispered through bedchamber curtains. It soaked into sheets that smelled of sweat, perfume, and desperation. And sometimes it cried, newborn, bloodied, or silent, from a cradle that determined the future of empires. In the palaces of kings and emperors, history was not just written in treaties or battles. It was written in the bodies of women, in every sigh withheld, in every child buried, in every secret carried by a queen who dared not speak. These were not just royal bedrooms, they were war rooms, and every woman inside them knew one wrong move could end a dynasty, or her life. Let us walk one final time through these halls. In the waning years of the Tudor dynasty, Elizabeth I reigned alone. The child of Anne Boleyn, once condemned for loving too much, now ruled with calculated solitude. No heir, no consort, no scandal the court could seize upon. She declared herself married to her people, her body the realm's sanctuary. But that image came at a cost. Behind the powdered face and bejeweled gowns was a woman who slept alone. Every night her attendants removed her wigs, wiped her pale paint, and saw the thinning hair, the rotting teeth, the aching joints. She had refused to become a vessel like her mother. But she paid with loneliness, with paranoia, with the knowledge that once she died, her bloodline would die with her. Her private secretary once found her weeping on the floor, murmuring that she was tired. So very tired. Power is a crown of iron, no matter how many rubies decorate it. But at least Elizabeth had ruled. Many royal women never tasted even a whisper of agency. In France, the royal court of the early 18th century became a carnival of indulgence under Louis XV. The king, bored with ceremony, created a private retreat called the Parc aux Cerfs, a hidden mansion where young girls were brought to entertain him. Most were barely teenagers, chosen for their freshness, their pliability, their ignorance. They were dressed, schooled, renamed, and summoned. Some bore children, some went mad, all were forgotten. The palace explained this away as custom. A man of such power could not be expected to live monastically. But the girls who left that house carried more than memory. They carried shame, trauma, silence. No portrait hangs for them, no tomb bears their name. And still this pattern endured across continents. In the Qing dynasty, the Forbidden City remained a place of unbearable stillness. Consorts might be summoned once a year, if at all. An empress might go a decade without seeing her husband. Jealousy brewed in isolation. Some women turned to books, others to poison. The corridors echoed not with laughter, but with the soft footsteps of eunuchs and the rustle of silks that carried no joy. One woman, consort Jen, known later as the Pearl Concubine, had been favored by the Guangxu Emperor. She supported his modernizing ambitions, his reforms, his dreams. But when Empress Dowager Cixi, his aunt and political rival, grew angry, Zhen's fate was sealed. In 1900, as foreign troops approached Beijing, Cixi ordered her execution. Zhen was thrown into a well, no ceremony, no final words. Even the favored could become ghosts in an instant. And what of the men? They too were prisoners, in a fashion. Kings were not free to love. Emperors did not marry for desire. Every decision about intimacy, who to lie with, when and why, was measured, advised, documented. Kings were told to visit their wives regularly to ensure succession. If they failed, rumors of impotence arose. If they strayed, political enemies might manipulate mistresses. Louis XVI of France, for instance, was mocked for his supposed lack of virility. Pamphlets described his inability to consummate his marriage to Marie Antoinette, painting them both as failures. The pressure was unbearable. Eventually, under quiet medical guidance, he succeeded. A daughter was born, then a son. But the rumors never stopped. And when revolution came, the bedroom was as much a battlefield as the streets. The king and queen were put on public trial, not just for tyranny, but for imagined perversions. Marie Antoinette was accused of seducing her son. Her defenders wept in court. Her enemies laughed. Truth no longer mattered, only spectacle. Because the palace bed, once a sanctuary, had become a stage, and the world now demanded a new play. Still, not all stories end in tragedy. In the Mughal Empire, Empress Nur Jahan rose from a widow to the most powerful woman in India. Though not born into royalty, she married Emperor Jahangir and soon eclipsed his other wives in influence. She issued imperial orders in her own name, minted coins bearing her image, and governed court affairs. But her power was intimately tied to her ability to maneuver within palace walls. She used beauty, intellect, and strategic marriage to elevate her family. She was adored, feared, and respected. Her name endured. Yet even Nur Jahan lived in constant danger. If the emperor died or turned cold, she could fall in an instant. Royal love was never unconditional. It was a ledger of usefulness. Across the seas in Korea's Joseon dynasty, palace women were governed by a system of brutal hierarchy. Court ladies served in ranks. Mistakes were punished with flogging. Affairs, real or rumored, could end in death. In one infamous case, Crown Princess Hui, accused of adultery, was executed by forced suicide. Her body was left unattended. Years later, it was revealed she had been framed. A court faction had wanted her gone. They succeeded. Because truth was a fragile thing in royal courts, and intimacy, weaponized, could kill. Even in the 20th century, royal women were not spared. Empress Wanrong of the short-lived Manchukuo state, a puppet empire controlled by Japan, was once a celebrated beauty. Married to Puyi, the last emperor of China, she was adored in public, but abandoned in private. Puyi, indifferent and manipulated by the Japanese, left her isolated. She turned to opium, lost her child, lost herself. After the fall of Manchukuo, she was captured by communist forces. She died in a prison cell, her body buried in an unmarked grave. She had once worn the robes of an empress. She died nameless. All the silks, the jewels, the gilded ceilings, they had meant nothing in the end. And yet these women endured. Not all as queens, not all as lovers, but as symbols of what happens when desire becomes law, when intimacy is politicized, when a woman's worth is measured in her ability to bleed, bear, and be silent. The palaces still stand, some as museums, others as ruins. Tourists walk through them, marveling at the chandeliers, the velvet cushions, the carved bedposts. But they do not hear the muffled cries, the whispered prayers, the silence of women who were never meant to be remembered. But if you listen carefully, you might feel them. The queen pacing her chamber, waiting for blood that does not come. The concubine praying for the emperor to summon her, even if only once more. The mistress holding her newborn, wondering if it will live long enough to be named. The empress sitting in front of a mirror, removing her paint, staring at the face history has already forgotten. These are the true architects of empire, not the kings who held the scepter, but the women who bore its weight in silence. Not the generals who marched to war, but the wives who bred their replacements. Not the portraits on the wall, but the shadows that kept the palace from crumbling. History seldom gives them voice. But tonight, perhaps, it listens, and the bedchambers breathe again. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.